Well, it's been 10 years since the United States suffered the gravest act of terrorism in human history. Everyone who experienced the attack will remember the chaos, fear, courage, heroism, and despair of that day. Joining us today from College Station, Texas, is the man who informed President Bush of the news, Andy Card. He was the former chief of staff to the president and is currently the acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Thank you very much for joining us today, Andy. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your interest.
Mr. Card, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, you received news that no American has heard in 60 years. Namely, the United States is under attack. Your first instinct, and indeed your first duty, was to inform the president of the attack. Now, critics, shameless men like Michael Moore and others, viciously criticized President Bush for the 6 minutes of what they called stunned inactivity. Can you tell us what was going on behind the scenes during the time between when you gave the president the news and the time you got him out the door?
Well, before the president went into the classroom, we had been told that it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. So that's what the president knew when he went into the classroom. When I went in, I whispered in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." I was really glad that he stayed in his seat and he did nothing to introduce fear to those very young elementary school students, and he did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. But I was also a little bit selfishly glad that the president stayed in the classroom, because it allowed me to go back into the holding room and get some of the work done that had to be done in order for the president to be prepared to meet the challenge. The first one, I suggested we should get the FBI director on the phone. So get a phone line connected to the FBI director. Get a live phone line connected to the vice president and to the Situation Room. And I made sure that the crew was ordered to get back on Air Force One. We were going to have to leave. And I instructed the Secret Service to turn the motorcade around so that we could leave the building. And I also asked some of the people who were working on the president's speeches to work for some brief remarks that the president could make to a gathering of people in a gymnasium right next door. So there was an awful lot of work done. And if the president had come back into that holding room right after I whispered in his ear, everybody would have gone to the president, and he would have been barking out the orders. This way we could get the work done before he came back into that holding room. And sure enough, the first thing he did when he arrived in that holding room was say, "Get the FBI director on the phone." And we could say, "Right here, Mr. President."
Mr. Card, just as a quick follow-up to that, sir, obviously there's a tremendous amount of security and complexity involved with moving the president during times of peace. Were you suddenly faced during those 6 minutes with an enormously increased sense that the president was under extreme danger since the country was under attack?
Well, he was very safe in that classroom. We obviously had Secret Service protecting the classroom and protecting the president. We made sure we had a Secret Service agent always with the press pool, for example, and there were several in the classroom itself, in addition to around the building. And we also had some counter snipers around the building as well. So I never felt that the president was in danger at the Sarasota school, the Emma E. Booker School, at least in Sarasota. We did get an erroneous piece of information on the way to the airplane, Air Force One. We had heard that the Air Force One itself might be a target of attack, and so there was some angst around that. That proved to be the fog of war, however. It wasn't a reality.
Mr. Card, there's not a person who watched the events of that morning who was not stunned and in a state of shock, but with 10 years to reflect on the events in that schoolroom, would you have done anything differently that morning?
You know, I've thought about that many times. I don't think I would have done anything any differently. It was extremely, extremely rare that anyone like me had to deliver words that I had to deliver to a president. Never mind how extremely rare it would be for me to be able to do that in a setting that was a public forum where the president was sitting on camera. Chances are, if some other chief of staff were delivering news like that to a president, they'd be doing it in the solace of the Oval Office itself, or in a private hotel room, or somebody else's office. This was in a classroom in front of second graders with a press pool gathered such that everything that was going on was being recorded by someone in the press pool.
Yeah, there certainly were no cameras on FDR when he got the news of the Pearl Harbor attack 60 years earlier. Mr. Card, can you give us a sense of what was being discussed on the ride from the school back to Air Force One and some idea of the general discussion in the first hours once you were in the air?
Well, both the president and I were on telephones on the ride from the school to Air Force One. We were trying to reach people back in Washington, D.C. The president was on the phone with the folks at the National Security Council in Washington, D.C. that were meeting in a bunker underneath the White House called the PIOC. I was trying to track down Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. We then learned about the attack on the Pentagon. So we were busy. We were working the entire time. When we arrived at the airport, we very quickly went up the stairs to Air Force One, and almost before the president was taking his seat, they were shutting the door and getting ready to roll down the runway and take off. So we were all business. We were also trying to get the president into a place where he would be very, very safe, which was very high up in the air, and with relatively good communications. Air Force One had the best communications possible, but it proved not to be as good as the president wanted, and we actually addressed that as a subsequent plan after the attacks on September 11th.
Putting his security aside, Mr. Card, can you tell us where George Bush wanted to go?
There's no doubt. He was very, very anxious to get back to Washington, D.C. In fact, he and I had a pretty firm argument on Air Force One. He was ordering me to go to Washington, D.C. The Secret Service was telling me that they could not recommend going to Washington, D.C., and they were quite adamant about it. And even the folks with the Air Force were discouraging us from going to Andrews Air Force Base until we learned more about whether or not that facility would be safe if we were to go to Washington. So I'm weighing all of the options, where are the best places to go. A recommendation was finally made to go to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. I'm really glad we went there. They were already on the highest alert because they were in the middle of an exercise for a nuclear attack, and that's a B-52 bomber place, so there were long runways, and that's where we landed. We trimmed down the crew on Air Force One, the staffers that were traveling with the president and the guests, and then went from Barksdale Air Force Base to the Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska, where the president went down into a deep bunker. But the entire time, President Bush was pushing very hard to get back to Washington, D.C. And finally, once we got to Omaha and had our National Security Council meeting over the secure video conference there, when that ended, he said, we are going back to Washington, D.C., and the Secret Service acquiesced and said that it was okay to go back there.
You'd mentioned earlier that during the first few moments, you mentioned the fog of war and some of the rumors that Air Force One was a target. Do you recall some of the other rumors that may have been flying through official channels that did not turn out to be true? It was a crazy, crazy couple of hours there.
It was, first of all, the fog of war is real, and misinformation is part of life in those kinds of circumstances. So we had reports of planes that were not responding to the orders from the FAA to land, and the questions, do you have to send a fighter pilot up to shoot down that plane? Would there be other attacks around the country? Obviously, the attack on the World Trade Center was horrific. The attack on the Pentagon was horrific and demonstrated that we were at war. It wasn't just a single attack. And then we had the plane that crashed in the field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and that plane was headed to Washington, D.C., probably for a target called the U.S. Capitol, or maybe even the White House itself. But if it hadn't been for the courageous acts of American citizens on that flight, that plane may well have crashed into one of the symbols of power in Washington, D.C., too. So, yeah, there were a lot of scary rumors going around, and perfect knowledge was something we did not have. And there were great threats, and we were pretty cautious. But the president was anxious to get back to Washington, D.C. He wanted to demonstrate that the presidency was secure, that he was in charge and he was going to lead this nation. He also did it with a great cognizance of the horrific tragedy that had taken place, and he reminded us of the victims. And we thought at one time that there could have been over 10,000 people killed in the attack on the World Trade Center. Fate had it that the building was not as full of it as it would have been had it been after kind of normal starting hours for work. So it was a terrible, terrible attack, but it could have been much worse.
Yes, sir. We obviously count all the people who died that day, but the evacuation of those two buildings was done in remarkable fashion, and many of the men that did that didn't come home. Thank you very much for joining us today. That's part one of our interview with Andy Card. In part two, we'll dive into 9/11's aftermath. How did President Bush decide what our response to this massacre would be, and how well did we accomplish what we set out to do? For PJTV, I'm Bill Whittle.